What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Primetime Sports Podcast, hosted by Joey Mailari. So today is a special day. We got the NBA season starting tonight. Yesterday was the ALCS Game 7, which sent Toronto to the World Series to now face the Dodgers, with Game 1 being on Friday. We got the NHL season already underway. The NFL season is midway through. College football's midway through. College hockey's already started. And now with the NBA beginning, this is what every sports fan dreams of, with all these sports happening at once. There's always something to watch every single night. And that's why I love the NBA, because every single night, doesn't matter if it's a West Coast game that people are really looking forward to, let's say like the Warriors and the Lakers, or it could be even two Western Conference teams that people are down on, like the Utah Jazz and the Portland Trail Blazers. Every single given night, there are NBA games on for the most part. And that's what I love about the NBA season. When you just want to sit back, watch some hoops, and just watch a game late at night, there's always something on. So I'm excited for this season to begin. So in this episode, I'm going to go over a lot of things. I'll recap some of the storylines from the NBA in the offseason, talk about some trades that happened, talk about some teams that I think could potentially surprise some people. At the end, I'll give my predictions for the 1 through 15 seed in the Eastern Conference, and then the 1 through 15 in the Western Conference. And I'll also give my predictions for the NBA awards for the 2025-2026 NBA season. So let's start out with some of the trades from this past offseason. We'll begin with my team, the Los Angeles Clippers, and a deal that they made. And I do apologize if you hear some wind in the background. I'm outside recording this episode since I want to make sure that I could try to get this episode out before the start of the NBA season, with the first game being tonight at 7:30 between the Oklahoma City Thunder and the Houston Rockets. So we'll start out with the LA Clippers and a deal they made. This was a 3-team deal. The Clippers got John Collins and a second-round pick, and they traded Norman Powell to the Miami Heat, who has 1 year left on his deal. And then Utah got Kevin Love and Kyle Anderson. In this deal, I honestly thought it was kind of win-win situation for Miami, LA, and Utah. Utah got some more cap flexibility, getting rid of John Collins, which was a contract they were trying to move on from. Collins has 1 year left on his deal. He's a free agent after this year's over with. He's making $26.58 million this year, but Utah didn't want to pay him that money, and they wanted to move on from him, so they got Kevin Love in return, who's on an expiring contract, and then Kyle Anderson, who has this upcoming season and 1 more year left on his deal after that, so he has 2 years left on his deal at pretty good team money, only just about $10 million in each of those 2 seasons. So that's a pretty team-friendly contract there for them, and Kyle Anderson's a good player, a good veteran that can be a good asset for any team as a role player, so they end up getting him in that deal. And then you look at the LA side, the Clippers get a legitimate power forward, which is something they've needed for years now. Running with Paul George or Kawhi Leonard at the 4 was never really something that worked for them, even though they obviously had some success and won a lot of regular season games with either one of those guys being the power forward. They really needed a true power forward in this lineup, and John Collins obviously is that, and he's on an expiring deal, so they ended up moving on from one expiring deal and Norman Powell, who they didn't want to pay an extension to, who wanted his money, and the Clippers weren't willing to really pay him on an extension. And the Clippers are very meticulous what they're doing right now. If you look at their cap for the next few seasons, after the season's over with, they really only have Kawhi Leonard, Ivica Zubac, and Derrick Jones Jr. and Chris Dunn as the only real 4 rotation players that are still going to be under a guaranteed contract for the 2026-2027 NBA season. James Harden has a player option for next season. Same thing with Bradley Beal, and then John Collins will be a free agent. So the Clippers are going to have a lot of money to potentially open up after this upcoming season's over with. In the 2026-2027 season, there are player options for, as I said, James Harden and Bradley Beal, and then there are team options for Bogdan Bogdanovic, Brooke Lopez, Nick Batum, and Kobe Brown. So they're going to have some flexibility. If you look at this team after the 2026-2027 season is over with, they're going to have nobody on the books besides Ivica Zubac, basically meaning this team is going to be able to go out and get anybody they want in free agency 2 years from now. And so they didn't really want to go out and pay a big long-term extension to Norman Powell. So they said, you know what? We'll go out and trade him and go get a true power forward, and that's what they got in John Collins, which I like this move. It gives the Clippers some cap flexibility for the future, since they may not pay John Collins, but they definitely didn't want to pay Norman Powell, it seemed. And then you also do get a second-round pick. With Tyler Herro being out now a month or so for the beginning of the NBA season, this is a good deal for the Miami Heat. Powell's going to be a very good scorer for them and probably be their primary option with Tyler Herro out. And if you look at this team, they got Bam Adebayo, Andrew Wiggins, Terry Rozier, Tyler Herro. Like, it's a roster that has talent, obviously, but They were lacking another scorer that could go out and get a bucket in crunch time, and that's what Norman Powell did for the Clippers for years. And Norman Powell, honestly, at the end of the day, was one of the most underrated Clippers over the last few seasons. Last year, after Paul George is off the team and he ends up walking in free agency, Norman Powell stepped up and was nearly an all-star. He just wasn't the exact same player in the second half of the season. After the all-star break was over with, he was battling injuries and was never the exact same player, and probably was still affected by the injuries even in the playoffs, but he was a great player for the Clippers over the last few seasons. Always hit some clutch shots for the Clippers. Always was a guy you could rely on in crunch time to go out there and make a play when the Clippers needed it most. He hustled a lot, played very hard. Norman Powell, thank you so much for your time in LA with the Clips. I really did enjoy watching you play, and I'm thankful that the Clippers had you on the team. When the Clippers had some injuries over the years with Paul George and Kawhi Leonard being out, and obviously even last year with some injuries as well, he always stepped up and found a way to really be that answer for the Clippers, especially in some of those dark moments when there were injuries to those superstars. So thank you so much for your time in LA, and I'm wishing you all the best in Miami. And I do think he's going to be a really good rotation player for him, and I hope he does get paid the money that he wants in free agency. Now moving on to another team here, we have the Brooklyn Nets making a trade with the Denver Nuggets. Michael Porter Jr. went to Brooklyn. Cam Johnson went to Denver in this deal. Denver had a very strong offseason. This team was on the verge of their window somewhat closing, in my opinion, last year during the regular season. Then they had a strong postseason and then had a great offseason as well, adding Tim Hardaway Jr. for another scorer, Jonas Valanciunas, and Bruce Brown, and then got Cam Johnson as well to replace Michael Porter Jr. And at the time, this deal Denver did because they wanted to get under the luxury tax and get off of Michael Porter Jr.'s contract. And this opened up a $14.1 million non-taxpayer mid-level exception for Denver. As I said, did get them under the luxury tax as well, which was their goal. And that ended up helping them go out and get guys like Tim Hardaway Jr., Bruce Brown, Jonas Valanciunas. They had some flexibility because of that trade they made with the Brooklyn Nets. Cam Johnson is a very good player, a really good scorer that is going to be a reliable guy next to Jamal Murray, Nikola Jokic, Aaron Gordon. He doesn't really need the ball in his hands every single player. He can play off the ball and stand in the corner and wait for somebody to drive and kick it out. And he's a very valuable player, honestly. That was a really good deal for them. And then Denver, in return, gave up Michael Porter Jr. and then also a 2032 first-round unprotected pick. And if you look at Brooklyn, you'd say, why would they want to do this deal, taking on Michael Porter Jr.'s big-time contract and giving up Cam Johnson, who is on a cheaper contract. Cam Johnson has, I believe, 2 years left on his contract, around $20 million or so dollars. And then you look at MPJ, has 2 years left on his deal at $38 million for this season, and then $41 million for next season before being a free agent after that. So you'd wonder why they wanted to do that deal. Well, first off, the NBA has a salary floor where every single team in the NBA needs to meet the minimum salary floor for all of their contracts combined on their roster. So Brooklyn saw this deal as a way to not only reach that threshold, which they're barely over right now, if I remember correctly, but they also added in a 2032 first-round pick as well that's unprotected, and this team's in a complete rebuild, so they're happy to add on a draft pick, only, having to pay a guy an extra $18 million a year for each of the next 2 seasons, with MPJ, as I said, making about $38 million this year, and then just about $41 million next season. They were fine giving basically double the money they were giving to Cam Johnson over those 2 years because they're now getting over the salary floor, which is what they wanted to do. And then also at the same time, they're adding in an unprotected first-round pick. And this team is in a complete rebuild. We'll see what they do in the next couple off seasons. It seems like every 4 or 5 years or so, this team is not afraid of going out and making a major splash, getting Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant back in 2019. Maybe this next year or so, they end up doing that again maybe a year from now. We'll see what they end up doing. But that was why they did this deal, to go out and add another pick. As for another trade, Drew Holiday got traded to the Portland Trail Blazers from the Boston Celtics. The Celtics, in return, received Anthony Simons and 2 second-round picks. Each of those 2 second-round picks were now redacted. The Celtics could look to move Simons at some point, since it seems like they're really game planning for 2 years away, since Jason Tatum will be missing this entire season probably. It really seems like they're really game planning for next year when Jason Tatum is back. In this deal, Portland got Drew Holiday, and even though Drew, it didn't seem like he wanted to be in Portland at first, he ends up staying there now, and he's going to be a valuable asset and a veteran for them in their young locker room. Definitely can really try to help some of those players, know what it's like to be a champion in the NBA, know what it's like to be a veteran that's played 16 years in the NBA and is a 2-time All-Star and a 2-time champ. Drew Holiday is the ultimate competitor and the true professional. He is definitely a guy you'd want in your locker room to be a leader, and that's definitely a good deal there for Portland, even though they obviously take on a lot of money there. They are a team that obviously need to spend some more money, and also at the same time, they're going out and getting a veteran that can really help those young guys like Scoot Henderson, like Shaden Sharp, like Tumani Kamara. This guy is going to be a guy in there that's going to be a valuable leader for each of those players. Drew Holiday is a leader and a winner, so I do like this deal for Portland, even though they're taking on a lot of money. And as for the Celtics, this deal made sense for them. They traded Kristaps Porzingis and Drew Holiday in order to save $180 million in projected tax penalties, which also got them under the second apron. They weren't willing to spend big money this offseason and for this current season, knowing that Jason Tatum is going to be out. They figured they probably weren't going to win the NBA championship, and that's why they let Al Horford walk in free agency, Luke Cornett walk in free agency. They traded Kristaps Porzingis and Drew Holiday. They knew this team was probably not going to win a championship with Tatum being out, so they weren't willing to be heavily over the luxury tax again for another year and pay up to $180 million in projected tax penalties extra by having Porzingis and Drew Holiday on their roster. Then you look at another trade. Porzingis got traded to Atlanta. This is a really good deal for them. Porzingis and a second-round pick to Atlanta, and the Celtics got Georges Niang, who they already cut, and a second-round pick. That wasn't the best return for Porzingis, but considering his health issues and the big contract, he had low value this offseason. Atlanta had an impressive offseason, considering that the East is going to be weaker this season with Milwaukee, Indiana, and Boston all expected to take steps back. This Eastern Conference is wide open this year, and you look at Atlanta, they added Luke Kennard, they added Kristaps Porzingis, and they added Nickeil Alexander-Walker. That's three really good rotation players for them, and Porzingis could end up being the guy that takes them over the top. He was a really valuable piece for the Celtics in their championship run. We'll see what he does there in Atlanta. That's a team that lost Clint Capella this offseason, so now they obviously do go out there and get Porzingis, who's going to be a valuable piece for them if he can stay healthy and return to form of what he was a couple seasons ago for the Celtics. And then in this deal as well, the Brooklyn Nets received Terrence Mann in the number 22 pick in the 2025 NBA draft, who ended up being Drake Powell out of UNC, who has great athleticism. I think he's going to fit very well in that Brooklyn lineup. Terrence Mann goes back to Brooklyn where he was born. I do like this trade for Brooklyn as well. They really just got involved, basically just make the money work, and also they added in another draft pick, which that's Brooklyn's way over the last few seasons. They're happy to obviously be a team that's involved in deals. And in this deal, they weren't really giving up anything in this deal at all. Not giving up anything, but in order to make the money work, these teams needed a third team to jump in. In order to jump in, the Brooklyn Nets had to take on Terrence Mann's contract, and in return, they got the 22nd pick as well, which they ended up taking, as I said, Drake Powell, who I think will be a good NBA player for them. And then another trade, and this is the last one I'm going to mention, Desmond Bane got traded to the Orlando Magic at the beginning of the offseason. Orlando received Desmond Bane, and Memphis in return got Orlando's first-round pick in 2025, Phoenix's first-round pick in 2026, Orlando's first-round pick in 2028, Orlando's first-round pick in 2030, and swap rights with Orlando's first-round pick in 2029, along with Cole Anthony and Kentavious Caldwell-Pope. Cole Anthony was let go after this deal, and he ended up signing with the Milwaukee Bucks. If you look at this deal, though, this is an elite trade package for Memphis. For Desmond Bane, who is a good player, and he's a good scorer, similar to Norman Powell, honestly. But to be worth 5 picks is pretty crazy to me. He's a very good player and a good scorer. But at the same time, when you look at 5 draft picks, I think he's a little bit overrated in respect to what he was traded for. And this is what Orlando's needed. They've needed a good scorer that can shoot the three and obviously be a playmaking, scorer that can score off the ball and create his own shot. And that's what they got in this deal. Desmond Bane is going to be a good scorer for them, especially catch and shoot threes. He could score. But that's a heavy price to pay. I don't really love that deal for Orlando, but they want to go out and make a splash, and Bane ends up being that answer for them. Now moving on to other news in the NBA, Russell Westbrook just signed a 1-year, $3.6 million deal with the Sacramento Kings. He's going to return to his home state and play in Sacramento. He was a free agent all summer long, but finally found a home. He spent the 2024-25 season with Denver and was a really good player for them, averaging 13 points, 6 rebounds, and 5 assists. Was a starter in 36 games out of 75 games he appeared in. So obviously he can still be a good contributor in the NBA. Still has elite athleticism and brings a tenacity defensively that I think this team could definitely use. He's going to add some playmaking to that Kings lineup, which is kind of what they need next to DeMar DeRozan, Zach LaVine, and Domantas Sabonis. They need a guy that can facilitate, and even though Russell Westbrook isn't going to be that score-first, shoot-first guy that he was in Oklahoma City and Houston and even in Washington. He's going to be a good complementary piece next to those players. I'm excited to see what this Kings team looks like. I know a lot of people are down on this Kings team, but they have a lot of my favorite players in one lineup. DeMar DeRozan and Zach LaVine are two fun players to watch. They can go out and get a bucket any given possession. And then you add in a guy like Domantas Sabonis, who's the best rebounder in the NBA probably and one of the best playmaking bigs in the NBA. And then you add in Russell Westbrook, who is still a very athletic point guard that can go out there and make plays and was a real good contributor for Denver in that playoff run that they just had, and they took Oklahoma City to 7 games. But Russell Westbrook was a big piece in them beating the Los Angeles Clippers in 7 games in the first round of the Western Conference Finals last year. We'll see what he does for this Kings team, but I do like this move. I think a lot of people are sleeping on this Sacramento Kings team. I expect this team to be better than people expect. You have a lot of veterans there. You have some guys that can score. Obviously, spacing could be a problem, but Russell Westbrook, if he could be that pass-first point guard and go out there and facilitate and help that offense run, I think this team could score some points and potentially make noise as a potential playoff team in the Western Conference. I think a lot of people are expecting this team to be a 9, 10, or 11 seed. I think they could be better than that. I truly do. And then you add in Dennis Schroeder and Malik Monk, who are two good scoring point guards. Malik Monk is very athletic, and Dennis Schroeder can go out there and get a bucket any given possession as well. I think this team's going to be able to score. I know defense will be a worry, and obviously spacing will be a worry, but I hope that Russell Westbrook is able to help facilitate this offense and bring some of that defensive tenacity and energy that this Kings team needs. Now moving on to the LA Clippers. And I'll talk more about some of these teams maybe when I get to my predictions for each of the seeds in the Western and Eastern Conference. But the Clippers had a very good offseason. You look at this team, they added in John Collins, already mentioned, and they also added in Bradley Beal, Chris Paul, and Brook Lopez. And this was a team that took Denver to 7 games last year, and that Denver team ended up going on and taking the champion Oklahoma City Thunder to 7 games as well. But this Clippers team took Denver to 7 games last year, and now they added a legitimate power forward, which this Clippers team has now lacked for the better part of the last 4 or 5 seasons. And that's part of the reason they could never get by a team like Dallas in the playoffs at Denver and never could really beat Minnesota in the regular season. And now they also added a true and reliable backup 5 who could score off the bench, another consistent need that the Clippers have needed over the last few seasons. And they never really had a backup 5 they could rely on. And now they obviously have Brook Lopez, who I think is going to be an X factor for this team this season. I really think he's going to be the missing link that this team has needed. I know he's older and he's up there in age, but when you look at this team, they've needed a backup 5 that they could trust in situations and maybe give Ivica Zubac some rest in some key moments. And I think Brook Lopez is going to be that answer for them. And then they also added a playmaking backup point guard who can still go out there and facilitate in Chris Paul. I know he's old as well, but I do think he's going to be a contributor off the bench for this team, and he was good last year for San Antonio. And then they also added another scorer to replace Norman Powell, and that's Bradley Beal, who is still a bucket getter. I know a lot of people are down on Bradley Beal because he obviously struggled next to Kevin Durant and Devin Booker, but this is a guy that can still go out there and get 30 points any given night. I really like his role with this Clippers team, and I was psyched they signed him, especially considering the money they got Bradley Beal at. 2 years, $11 million, so $5.5 million a year with the player option for that second season. You look at the money he was getting in Phoenix. He had 2 years left at around $111 million left on his son's contract. And after being bought out, he did give up $13 million. I think it was about $14 million in order to let the buyout happen. And that money that was left, so it's about $97 million. The Phoenix Suns are going to stretch over 5 seasons. So at $19.4 million a year, they are going to stretch that money. But they obviously wanted some cap flexibility, and that's kind of the reason they traded Kevin Durant as well, because they were really left in a tough spot. They need to get rid of at least one of, if not 2 of those contracts in Beal, Booker, and Durant. It ends up being Durant and then Bradley Beal on a waive and stretch. They traded Durant to Houston and then obviously waived and stretched Bradley Beal. But if you look at the money, if he was at $56 million a year, obviously it's a little bit different, and it's not like he's worth that much money right now at the way he's playing in Phoenix. But when you're getting Bradley Beal at $5.5 million a year, that is an absolute bargain and definitely worth the risk, because there really is no risk there with that money. Very low risk and potential high reward there for the Clippers. I'm really excited to see what he does in LA, and I thought that was the deal of the offseason for the Clippers. Even though I think Brook Lopez is going to be the X factor for the Clippers, going out there and getting Bradley Beal to replace Norman Powell was an excellent move. For credit to the Clippers front office, Lawrence Frank, I think, had an excellent offseason, and I'm excited to see what this team looks like this season. I think Bradley Beal was an excellent move for this team. And like I said, when you're getting him at $5.5 million a year and not $55 million a year, there's just so much value there. And expectations are obviously lower now when he has James Harden, Kawhi Leonard, and Ivica Zubac all ahead of him as, guys that are going to get more shots than him probably. there's lower expectations, and obviously it comes with, the contract, $5.5 million a year. The Clippers not necessarily married to him for the next, 4 or 5 seasons. So it gives the Clippers some flexibility, obviously gives them some scoring as well. This was a great offseason move. Like I just mentioned, credit to Lawrence Frank and that front office for a great offseason with what they did, getting Bradley Beal, John Collins, Chris Paul, Brook Lopez, and then I loved what they did in the draft. In the first round, they got Yannick Conan Niederhauser at the 30th overall pick. He's 7'3", is a really good center with a lot of athleticism, a very good shot blocker who has elite upside potential defensively, and then obviously on the offensive end as well. He can finish at the rim pretty well and can jump up the gym. I thought that was a great move for the Clippers, drafting him at 30th overall. I expect him to be a contributor this season off the bench. I know a lot of people expect him to be a guy that sits on the bench and maybe plays in the G League, to start out, but I think he could be a legitimate player for this Clippers team. I thought that was a great pick at 30th overall. And now moving on to another question of the offseason, and that's, will Giannis Antetokounmpo be traded in the future? When I look at this Bucks roster, I see them struggling more than most people expect. I know the Miles Turner addition will help them in the interior and will also help them spread the floor offensively, and now that's probably the best front court, if not the best, but one of the best front courts in the Eastern Conference with Giannis and Miles Turner down there. So I do like that move in that regard. I think it's going to help space the floor, and obviously he's a very good defensive player, and he's obviously younger than Brook Lopez. But Lopez was not the issue, I don't think, in Milwaukee. I don't think just because they got rid of him and added Miles Turner, that's going to be the solution to them, being another Eastern Conference contender for a year and potentially an NBA Finals threat. I think Milwaukee needed another scorer, which they had in Damian Lillard if he stayed healthy, and they were able to keep him. Obviously, with his injury, they made the decision this offseason to waive and stretch his contract, which that was kind of the role of the offseason. Waive and stretch we saw a few times, obviously with the Bradley Beal situation, and now in the Damian Lillard situation, they waived and stretched his contract in order to go out and get that cap flexibility to go out and get Miles Turner, and then Lillard ended up returning home to Portland. He's going to be out most of, if not all of the season, and I think this Milwaukee team saw that, and they said they don't want to waste a prime year of Giannis. So they said, let's go out and try to just do what we can with what we have. And that obviously ended up being moving on from Damian Lillard and going out and getting Miles Turner. But I look at this team, I think they're just lacking three-point shooting. I think they're lacking some consistency from the guard position. With this team right now, I'm looking at their roster. They have Giannis and Kyle Kuzma with Miles Turner as their top 3 players. And then Kevin Porter Jr. as the starting point guard. And he could still get buckets. He was just inconsistent last year, but he can still get buckets. And he was a better playmaker when he was in Houston than he was in LA or with Milwaukee last season. We'll see what he does as their starting point guard. I don't really love their bench. I think they're going to lack three-point shooting as a team. Right now, their best three-point shooter might be Gary Trent Jr. And he's a good player, but I just think this team needed more scoring and more three-point shooting. When you look at the Damian Lillard situation, I did mention that they waived and stretched his contract. He had $113 million left on his deal. And in order to go out and get Miles Turner, they had to get rid of that. So they ended up waiving and stretching his contract over 5 seasons with around $22.5 million being spread out over the next 5 seasons through 2030. And that obviously ended up letting them go out and get some short-term flexibility to go and add Miles Turner. Lillard, as I mentioned, is going to be out for most of, if not all of the season after he tore his Achilles last year in the first round of the NBA playoffs. With Damian Lillard being out, I know this Milwaukee front office worried about, Giannis's prime being wasted, and that could maybe lead to him requesting a trade. So they'd rather carry a cap hit for the future in order to have some short-term flexibility to try to keep Giannis happy and go out and get another playmaker next to him in Miles Turner. That obviously is a big-time loss for Indiana. And then Miles Turner is going to be a guy that's going to wreak havoc down there with Giannis. That's going to be a very good front court. We'll see what happens with this move. And in this offseason, they also added in both of Giannis's brothers as well. So now Giannis has both of his brothers on this team in Milwaukee, which I think is just a way to keep him happy and try to keep him in Milwaukee. But I do see this season going south for this Milwaukee team. We'll hear my predictions very soon at the end of this episode. But I think this Milwaukee team really struggles this season. That's just my gut feeling and where I'm at right now with this team. I think they lack three-point shooting. We'll see if I'm right. I could also be really wrong. That's the thing I want to preface with a lot of these predictions. They're just gut feelings and how I feel right now. And obviously when you're making predictions at the beginning of the season, no one knows who's going to get hurt, which players are going to fall off, which players are going to sprout and end up becoming a star. You never know how a season's going to shake out. That's the beauty of the NBA. So I'm going to be right with some of these predictions. I'm going to be wrong with some of these predictions. But I got to make predictions based on how I feel right now. And I think this Milwaukee team struggles. And I do think in the future Giannis will request a trade. Whether or not Milwaukee trades him, who knows? I don't think they trade him because you're trading the best player in the NBA, in my opinion, so I don't think they trade him, but I guess you never know. We'll see what the future holds there for the Bucks. Now I want to transition and talk about DeMar DeRozan, who I think is one of the most underrated players in NBA history. This has been a conversation I've had with some of my friends over the past few months. Is DeMar DeRozan a top 75 player in NBA history? I think yes. And I think since it's even questioned whether or not he's top 100, then he's one of the most underrated players in NBA history. Especially when you look at his stats, DeMar DeRozan is a very talented player. He's averaged 21 points, 4 rebounds, 4 assists in his career. He averaged 22.2 points per game last season in Sacramento. At 35 years old, that's very impressive. He's 6th among active players in all-time scoring. He has 25,292 points in his career. That's 25th most in NBA history. That's a stat I don't think many people realize. He's 25th all-time in NBA points. Carmelo Anthony is in 10th with 28,289 points. DeMar DeRozan is just about 3,000 points off of that. 2,997 points off of 10th all-time in NBA scoring. To put that into perspective, DeRozan scored 1,710 points last season for Sacramento. If he can have another 2 seasons where he plays around 70 to 75 games and averages around 20 to 23 points per game, he would be right there or at a top 10 scorer of all time in NBA history if he could do that over the next few seasons. And I know he's 36 years old, and I know it depends on what some of the active players above him do, like Russell Westbrook and James Harden, what they do over the next few seasons. But DeRozan is still an elite bucket getter. He doesn't get the respect he deserves. It was still really good last season for Sacramento. I know he's 36 years old, and at the end of the day, people are going to say he's going to fall off at some point and not be a 20-point-per-game scorer, which he's been basically consistently his entire career. But he's still capable of 35 points right now any given night. And I actually really like the DeMar DeRozan-Zach LaVine duo. Yes, they had their issues with spacing in Chicago, and they never really got the ultimate job done. Didn't really ever have any postseason success. But if you're a fan of offense and you're a fan of scoring, they're a fun duo to watch. I'm not talking about, that you want them to win a ring. I get that. Every single player and every single team wants to win a ring. But if you just want to watch some offense and you want to learn about how to score the ball and how to shoot and create your own shot, watching Zach LaVine and DeMar DeRozan any given night on TV is a joy to watch. It was interesting to see Sacramento decide to trade for LaVine last year. We'll see what they do together now with another full season ahead. And I know they didn't really ever have that success in Chicago. The Western Conference is tough, so I don't really know if they're going to go out and make, some major noise in the playoffs. But I see this team being a potential surprise team in respect to what people are expecting from them. I think this team can surprise some people. And like I mentioned, LaVine and DeRozan, they're fun to watch. They can score. I know spacing is going to be an issue. I know defense might be an issue with this team. I think Russell Westbrook is going to help with the playmaking and definitely facilitating. That's going to be something this team needs, somebody that can bring the ball up and try to make shots for everybody else around them. Westbrook's going to be able to help with that. And I think defensively as well, even though Westbrook isn't the best defensive player on the floor, he hustles. He brings a lot of energy every single possession. I think that's what that team needs there. So I'm excited to see what he does there for them next to DeRozan and LaVine and Sabonis. I think this team is going to surprise some people, but I did want to get those thoughts out there about DeMar DeRozan before the season began because he's going to get very close and he's going to rise up the ranks and be in the top 20 maybe, in scoring very soon and then potentially even top 10 over the next couple seasons. So I want to get my thoughts out there before that happens so then people don't say, you're only saying he's the most underrated player ever or he's top 100 because he's now top 10. Where he stands right now, top 25, I think he's one of the best scorers in NBA history. A smooth bucket getter that can create his own shot, get to the bucket, shoot the mid-range just as well as anyone. Still a really good player. I'm excited to see what DeRozan does this year in Sacramento. And like I said, I think he's top 75, but I know even people question whether or not he's top 100. I think he's an absolute lock to be a top 100 player, and I still consider him top 75 as well. I know a few years ago when they did the top 75 rankings, he was not on there, but he's had a lot of success even the last few years scoring the ball and has rised up the ranks now to 25th all-time in scoring. I think he's a top 75 player in NBA history, and I'm fine saying that. I know some people will disagree with me. He doesn't have the rings and the playoff success, but DeMar DeRozan is a very talented player and a guy that still is one of the best bucket getters in the league. Now moving on to another topic, and this is about the 76ers. Do the Philadelphia 76ers bounce back from a disappointing last season? Joel Embiid obviously needs to stay healthy. He only played 58 games over the last 2 seasons. He had a 3-year window, though, over the last 3 years where he averaged 32.5 points per game over 173 games, which is very impressive. He averaged 32.5 points per game over a 173-game stretch over the last 3 seasons with 11 rebounds per game and 2.7 steals and blocks per game, which for short is stocks. So 2.7 stocks per game. Embiid is still a top 3 player in the NBA when healthy. Obviously, the issue is health, and it's obviously a question mark whether or not he's going to be on the floor. But when he is out there, the Sixers were a threat to win the East each and every season when he's healthy. In the 2023 playoffs, they had the Celtics down 3-2 in a series. The Philadelphia 76ers were up on the Celtics in 2023, 3-2, and obviously blew that lead. The Celtics ended up winning that series and then lost to the Warriors in the finals. But this Sixers team, when Embiid is healthy, is a major threat to win the East. And I know the major question mark is whether or not he can stay healthy, and the same thing goes for Paul George, who really struggled last year in 41 games with Philadelphia, averaged only 16 points, 5 rebounds, 4 assists, with 1.8 steals per game. He only played half the season, just 41 games, so part of the issue for him is obviously staying healthy, and another part of the issue for Paul George is the same issue that was there for Bradley Beal in Phoenix. Paul George and Bradley Beal are not used to being the third option. And also, Paul George did battle injuries last season, which hurt him as well, so he never really found a rhythm. And although Kawhi Leonard was always the lead player in LA when they were teammates, Paul George was capable any given night of being the best player on the floor for either team. He was, every single given night, he had the opportunity to be the best player out of the 10 guys on the floor. Paul George is still a very good player. I understand he's 35 years old, and the $52 million max contract that he's getting is probably an overpay. Even if he has a bounce-back year, that's still an overpay, considering he's 35 years old and is coming off a tough season. And he was riddled with injuries last season, just like a lot of those guys in that Sixers lineup. But I still think he's better than what he showed last year in his first year as a Sixer. I expect him to bounce back. I'm a big fan of Tyrese Maxey. I think he's going to be a very good player for them this year, as he's been for the last few years. He's really rised up the ranks in the NBA and is one of the best scorers in the league. I like Kelly Oubre. He can kind of do whatever you need on the floor, whether it's get a big rebound, get a steal, get a bucket in a big moment. Kelly Oubre can find himself in any lineup just because he gels well with the guys around him. I expect him to have a good year as well, and I like VJ Edgecombe, who they took in the draft. I think the Sixers team can surprise people this year. I really do, and I do expect them to bounce back. Now moving on to a quick question. Is it a make-or-break year for the New York Knicks and Cleveland Cavaliers? I would say, because this year is as wide open as ever the Eastern Conference has been, it is a make-or-break year for the Cavaliers and the Knicks. When you look at the Pacers, probably taking a step back with Halliburton being out. I think the Bucks take a step back as well. The Celtics will take a step back probably with Tatum being out. So injuries are a major factor there for Indiana and Boston. And then Milwaukee, I just don't really love their roster that they have right now. That's just my opinion. I'll explain more of it maybe when I get to talking about the Bucks, which I've already talked about a little bit when I talked about Giannis. But I do think since the Eastern Conference is as wide open as ever, it is a make-or-break year for Cleveland and New York. Even though they have a lot of their core still under contract after this current season is over with, they do need to bounce back and figure things out. And they both are very talented teams, have a lot of returning health and a lot of returning talent. I know that the Cavs do have Darius Garland hurt to begin the year, which is definitely a worry, but he'll be back at some point. But they have a lot of talent returning. There's a lot of pressure on those two teams to figure things out. Now the Knicks have a new coach in Mike Brown, so maybe that'll mix things up and give them more playoff success. They did go to the Eastern Conference Finals last year, and the Cavs obviously fell short again, which it's basically 2 years in a row they've just fell short in the playoffs. We'll see if this is the make-or-break year where they finally figure things out, the Cavaliers. Same thing for the Knicks. Either one of these teams, they're both capable of going to the finals. It's just about obviously putting it all together when they get to the playoffs. And now moving on, and the last thing I'll talk about before I give my NBA award predictions and then jump to my record predictions in the NBA is Kevin Durant and his impact in Houston. I'm now recording this part of the podcast the day after opening night. The first half of this podcast, the first 25 minutes or so were recorded yesterday on opening night, which was Wednesday night. You had Oklahoma City play the Houston Rockets in an absolute thriller. It was a double overtime game that Oklahoma City ended up winning. You saw Alperen Sengun go for 39 points for the Rockets. Kevin Durant had 23. You saw SGA only have, I think it was 5 points at halftime. Then he finished the game with 35. And you saw a double overtime game with the Thunder winning 125-124. A lot of back and forth in the last 4 or 5 minutes of regulation and then in both overtime periods. But it was a great game to watch. Credit to the NBA schedule makers who had that be the first game of the season. It was a great one to watch and definitely got everybody stoked for the rest of the year. But the Rockets, last night, I watched that team play, and this team is going to be good. I just do worry about them not having a point guard. I'll get to that in just a second, but I do want to talk about Kevin Durant and his impact in Houston. He did just sign a 2-year, $90 million extension with the Rockets with a player option for the 2027-2028 season. Durant now has surpassed LeBron James as the highest paid NBA player ever in player contracts at $598.2 million. So that doesn't include endorsements and the commercials they do and shoe brands. That is basically just money they make from the NBA player contracts. And now Durant is the highest paid player in NBA history with $598 million he's made on the floor. Durant is still an elite scorer. I know he's 37 years old, but I still see him as a top 3 to 5 scorer in the game. I made a point to a friend of mine a few weeks ago, but Kevin Durant has always been in his prime. He's always been a consistent 25 or 30 points per game. And especially when you look at his career and where he's been since a rookie, he's only had 1 year where he averaged less than 25 points per game in a season. And that was his rookie year where he averaged about 20 points per game. So every year in his 17-year career, 16 out of 17 years, he's averaged 25 or more points per game. And then in all 17 seasons he's played in, he's averaged 20 points or more per night, which is very, very impressive. So heading into this year, he's never really been anything less than a 25-point-per-game scorer for the most part, which is very, very impressive. Still a reliable scorer, a smooth dribbler who can get to his shots and get to his spots any given moment. His shot-making ability is something that Houston was definitely missing, which is why they traded for him. In the deal, the Rockets sent Jalen Green, Dylan Brooks, the number 10 overall pick, and multiple second-round picks to Phoenix. That number 10 overall pick in the draft ended up being the big man out of Duke, Kaman Maluak. A big issue for Houston is going to be their lack of playmaking at the point guard position, though, after Fred VanVleet went down with an off-season, season-ending injury. And that's something I thought heading into last night. I didn't just change my opinion because of what I saw last night. If I was able to finish this episode yesterday, I would have mentioned I worried about this team not having a point guard. I know the NBA nowadays is basically positionless basketball where you throw out your 5 best players on the floor a lot of the time, and whether or not you have a power forward or a point guard, that doesn't really matter as long as you have scoring and shooting potential and you have a big man that can space the floor and shoot the 3. That's what the NBA is all about now. There's not really traditional point guards or true power forwards anymore in today's game. You need guys that can be versatile and score. And basically every single player is capable nowadays of bringing the ball up the floor. You see centers being able to dribble like Joel Embiid. You see power forwards being able to dribble like Giannis Antetokounmpo. You see big men passing like Nikola Jokic. The NBA has completely changed. It really is positionless basketball now. Right now, though, this Rockets team, based on last night, Amen Thompson is going to be their starting point guard. And with Amen Thompson as the starting point guard at 6'7", he's the smallest player in their lineup. Kevin Durant is their starting shooting guard at 6'11". Jabari Smith at 6'11" is their starting small forward. Alperen Şengün is their starting power forward at 6'11", and he had a great year last year, 19 points, 10 rebounds per game. He had 39 points last night. He's a guy I've always been high on, and I expect 20 to 25 points per game this season. I'll be bold. I'll say he averages 23 points per game and 11 rebounds per game this year. And then they have Steven Adams as their starting center at 6'11". And based on those guys and their listed height, the average height in that lineup was 6'10" and 0.2 of an inch. That is the tallest starting lineup in NBA history on opening night. Based on their size and based on what I saw last night, this team is probably going to have to play a lot of zone defense rather than man defense like they did last night. But zone defense was a struggle for them at points last night, especially in the second half trying to stop SGA. So maybe they end up going man in certain situations and then zone in other situations. Ime Udoka, though, is a great coach. I expect him to be able to figure out the best rotation in the best lineups. So now I'm going to run down my NBA award predictions, and then I'll jump into my record predictions and my NBA playoff predictions. Starting out with the MVP vote, I am going Jalen Brunson as the NBA's MVP this year. He averaged 26 points and 7 assists per game last year off 38% shooting from 3. I expect him to have another big year, and if the Knicks are the number 1 seed in the East like I expect them to be, Jalen Brunson will definitely be in the conversation for the MVP vote. I wanted to go Anthony Edwards, but I ended up going with Brunson. Brunson's a guy I've definitely been critical of in the past because he does take a lot of shots, and at the end of the day, he's going to get his calls and be able to get to the free throw line. I've been critical of him in the past. I didn't know if he could be that 1A on a championship team, but he impressed me last year, especially in the playoffs. He was a really good player battling through injuries and still putting up good numbers. Jalen Brunson is my MVP pick this year in the NBA. Now moving on to Rookie of the Year. I have Ace Bailey and the Utah Jazz winning that this season over Cooper Flagg. I know a lot of people expect Cooper Flagg to win, but I think Ace Bailey will be the best player in this draft. He averaged 17 points and 7 rebounds last year as a freshman for Rutgers, and then in the preseason this year showed a lot of talent and potential, averaged 16 points and 5 rebounds. I expect him to do big things this year for Utah and be their future cornerstone piece that they build around. The Most Improved Player of the Year award, I'm going with Khalil Ware of the Miami Heat. Khalil Ware was really good in the preseason, averaged 18 points and 11.5 rebounds for Miami. He averaged 9 points and 7 rebounds last year as a rookie. I expect a double-double season out of him. I'm expecting around 15 points per game with 10 rebounds per game added on. My close pick here for Most Improved Player was Benedict Mathurin on the Utah Jazz, but I ended up siding with Khalil Ware. I think there's going to be more shots available for Andrew Nembhard and Benedict Mathurin, so they're going to be able to score more this year than they have in years past. But I do think Khalil Ware's season ends up being the best and the most improved year in comparison to what he did last year. I expect him to take another step up and move up in the ranks in the NBA. Defensive Player of the Year, I'm going with Amen Thompson. He averaged 14 points, 8 rebounds, 4 assists last year in Houston with 2.7 stocks per game. I see him as a top 25 player in the league this season. I think he's the best on-ball defender in the NBA, probably right next to him, I think, is Davion Mitchell. But I expect him to be the Defensive Player of the Year this season. He averaged 2.7 stocks per game last year, and I know he battled an injury at the end of last night's game against the Thunder, but I expect him, if he's healthy, to be right there for Defensive Player of the Year. Very impressive player, and I think he's a guy you definitely would want to build your franchise around. And then for Coach of the Year, I'm going with Quinn Snyder on the Atlanta Hawks. I expect big things from them this season. And some people might see that as a hot take, but I think this Hawks team is going to surprise some people in the East. Now moving on to my record predictions. We're going to start out with the West. I have Oklahoma City in first place with a 60-22 record. They kept their young core together, and they're going to even have more room to grow now, considering it's another year under their belt. They already have the championship as well, so there's a little less pressure on them. They do have some injuries heading into the year. They do have Jalen Williams out right now, but he'll be back at some point. They have a lot of strong chemistry, and obviously SGA is a really fun player to watch. Gets to his spots and makes his shots, especially in the clutch. This team is definitely still the team to fear in the Western Conference. I have them in first place at 60-22, but right behind them, a team that I think is going to contend with them for that Western Conference title is the Denver Nuggets. I have them at 57-25 this year. Denver's a team I was out on last year, but what an offseason they had after a really impressive postseason run as well. Bruce Brown, I think, ends up being the piece that they were missing. He was really important for them in their finals run a few years ago when they won a ring. He's a great glue guy off the bench that can really just merge into any lineup and play his role very well. I like Tim Hardaway Jr. as well as a scorer off the bench. That's going to strengthen their bench. And they also added Cam Johnson, who I think is similar to Michael Porter Jr., but I think is a little bit better of a player considering he's a little bit more efficient and obviously a little less injury prone. I do expect that Nuggets team to be right there in the West. I also expect the LA Clippers to be right there as well. This may be the most well-rounded Clippers team since the 213 era began back in 2019 when they had Paul George and Kawhi Leonard go to LA in one offseason. I have the Clippers at 54-28 this year. I think when you look at this team, there obviously is some age issues. People talk about James Harden and Kawhi Leonard being old, and then Brook Lopez and Chris Paul and Bradley Beal. But this offseason, Lawrence Frank did a great job. The Clippers finally got a true power forward in John Collins, a good backup, serviceable center in Brook Lopez. Obviously got a reliable point guard to play make off the bench in Chris Paul. And then also they added in as well another scorer that can be secondary to what James Harden and Kawhi Leonard do. And this is to fill Norman Powell's shoes. And that was going out and getting Bradley Beal on the best deal in the NBA, honestly, from this past offseason. 2 years, $11 million for a player like Bradley Beal. Even if he didn't necessarily have big-time numbers in Phoenix as a third option, I expect him to fit in well with this Clippers lineup. I know this offseason, Tyronn Lue and Jeff Van Gundy were very passionate about getting him to be a very good defensive player in this lineup. We'll see how his defense does this year, but I expect him to be a good scorer for this team and be right up there for whatever his role is, whether it's sixth man off the bench or being, that starting shooting guard. I expect a big role from him and a big, play every now and then, every given night from him. If I'm picking the Clippers lineup, I always love having the best 5 players on the floor, which in that case would be James Harden at the point guard position, Bradley Beal at shooting guard, Kawhi Leonard at small forward, John Collins at power forward, and then Ivica Zubac at center. That would be your best 5 players, but I do think it makes sense to maybe have Derrick Jones Jr. as the 4, and then you can stagger his minutes with John Collins and have John Collins off the bench to be another scoring option there next to Chris Paul and Brook Lopez. I think that makes sense. And then, you obviously have Nick Batum and Bogdan Bogdanovic as well. This Clippers team is very deep. I expect Kobe Brown to have a role in this rotation as well this year. He's a guy I'm very high on. I would like to see him get more minutes and get more opportunities. Since I see him as a very good role player in this league, I think he could be a good, valuable asset for this Clippers team. But I expect this team to be right there in the mix for the Western Conference #1 seed. I have them as the 3rd seed, but I think this team is capable of beating anybody in the West. Now moving on, I have the Houston Rockets as the 4th seed at 50-32. Ime Udoka is a very good coach. He's going to have his hands full, though, trying to find someone to run the offense as a playmaker without a real point guard. I think that might hurt the offense at times, especially bringing the ball up. You saw Şengün maybe turn the ball over once trying to dribble. You're going to see that when you don't have a true point guard that can bring the ball up and try to navigate and facilitate the offense. I think that's going to be something that hurts them this year. Adding Kevin Durant to an already strong lineup is obviously scary for the West, and Durant is still a very good player, but not having a point guard, I think, is somewhat of a worry. In the 5th place in the West, I have the Golden State Warriors at 46-36. The Warriors are an old team. They have 4 players that are 35 years or older, so just like the Clips, 2 very old lineups. They do a Draymond Green at 35 years old, Jimmy Butler at 36, Steph Curry at 37, and then Al Horford at 39. I do like Buddy Hield as another shooter next to Steph Curry. He's a guy that can still get you buckets in any moment. Steph is still an elite shooter, an elite scorer. Brandon Pajemski is a good glue guy. I like Quinton Post as a backup big man for them as well. Shout out Boston College Hoops. I think this team is going to be very capable of contending in the West. I know they're older, but last year when Jimmy Butler got traded from Miami to Golden State, they went on a nice run and had the potential to beat anybody in the West. I expect them to be a very good team this year as well if everybody's healthy. And a lot of my predictions with all of these teams is based on health and obviously based on guys staying up to par and playing, at the level they've been playing. But obviously, when a season begins, you never know who's going to get injured, which players are going to falter and, not have the same production, and you're not going to know which players are going to rise up the ranks and elevate their game. You never really know. And that's the beauty of the start of a new NBA season. It really is a wide open year. Anybody could potentially win. That's the beauty of a new year. It's just a clean new slate. We'll see what happens there in Golden State. In the 6th seed in the West, I have the Minnesota Timberwolves at 44-38. Nickeil Alexander-Walker will definitely be a miss for them, not having him in the lineup. But maybe that potentially opens up a bigger role for a guy like Terrence Shannon Jr., who has a lot of potential. I know they were happy when they drafted him a few years ago. Anthony Edwards will be a top 3 MVP candidate this year, and for good reason. He's the future of the league alongside Victor Wembanyama and Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. So when LeBron James, James Harden, Kawhi Leonard, Chris Paul, and all of those guys in that same era retire, the NBA is going to be in good hands because obviously you still have really good players that are still in their prime like Nikola Jokic and Giannis Antetokounmpo, and then you have even younger players like Victor Wembanyama alongside Anthony Edwards and SGA to be that other force next to them, next to those guys, Jokic and Giannis, to be the face of the league and obviously be the guys that people want to watch any given night. Now, in the 7th seed in the West, I have the San Antonio Spurs at 42-40. They added Dylan Harper in the draft to a roster that was already good last year. They did underperform a little bit, but had some injuries. They do have De'Aaron Fox, who will be healthy this season, Devin Vassell, and Victor Wembanyama, who is also healthy heading into this year. As long as Wemby stays healthy, this team will be dangerous. Wemby is a really fun player to watch on each end of the floor. Excited to see what he does this year with a full year healthy next to De'Aaron Fox. And then in the 8th place in the West, I have the Sacramento Kings at 41-41, which may be a surprise. I know a lot of people talk about spacing and defense being a primary concern for them, but I think their offensive potential could overshadow their defensive weaknesses. They have Keon Ellis, who is a very good defensive player, and Russell Westbrook, who can be a burst of energy on each end of the floor. I expect this team to outperform people's expectations. I'm a big fan of Zach LaVine, DeMar DeRozan, Domantas Sabonis, Russell Westbrook, Malik Monk, Dennis Schroeder. Those are guys I've always enjoyed watching play. So I'm excited to see what they do this year. I'm definitely going to be locked into watching that Kings team. I started liking Zach LaVine and DeMar DeRozan more of a duo over the last year or so, probably more in the offseason, because I started watching a lot of their highlights, and I just started realizing how great and how dynamic they are as bucket getters. Those dudes just show up every single given night, and they're capable of putting up 20 to 25 points each. They had some really good games together in Chicago. As I said, they did lack postseason success, and that's one thing that people will talk about when they look at that era in Chicago and now in Sacramento, is that they do lack postseason success. But they're fun to watch, as I mentioned. If you're just trying to watch guys that can go out there and score a bucket at any of the 3 levels, which DeRozan isn't the best shooter, but he can shoot the 3 a little bit, and he doesn't really take many threes, so that's one tough thing with his game. He loves the mid-range and obviously can get to the bucket as well. But they're fun players to watch. If you want to learn and try to add some more things to your bag when you're out there just playing pickup basketball, watching those guys play in an NBA game, you're going to learn a lot from them. So I have the Kings in the 8th place in the West, and then in the 9th place, I have the Dallas Mavericks just a spot below them, losing the tiebreaker to the Kings. I have the Mavericks at 41-41. I don't like Cooper Flagg as a starting point guard for them, which it seems like that's their plan heading into this season. I do think that's a lot to throw on a young player to carry the offense and be a playmaker and be a guy that can really step into that role that Kyrie Irving had and try to lead that offense, especially after they traded Luka Doncic. Kyrie had to be that lead guy, and that obviously ended up leading to him having to carry the team, and obviously he put a lot of wear and tear on his body over that last, month to try to get them, high enough to get into the playoffs. And really good player, Kyrie, obviously got hurt, unfortunately, at the beginning of the playoffs last year. Now they're basically asking Cooper Flagg to step in and carry that offense and be a playmaker. I think that's a lot to put on him. Anthony Davis being healthy will be key for this team this year as they await a potential late season return by Kyrie Irving. I do like Max Christie and Najee Marshall as well as depth on the bench. Those guys can play and get you a bucket. In the 10th seed in the West, I have the LA Lakers at 40 and 42. LeBron James will be out for probably the first month of the season with a sciatica issue, which I think is a worry for them. I thought this before heading into last night, so it's not really just because I saw them play last night that I didn't think they would be successful or a threat in the West. I felt heading into yesterday that I thought this team would struggle. I didn't think they'd be successful or a threat in the West. Even with Luka Doncic in better shape and LeBron James coming back from injury at some point, I worry about this team's depth. Same thing was the same issue for me last year with this team. I just thought they lacked bench depth and lacked scoring off the bench. Their bench unit is going to struggle to score, which is still a worry. So that's why I have this team as 10th in the West. I know it's a hot take. We'll see how things play out. I could be completely wrong. You never know at the end of the day. DeAndre Ayton was another offseason move they made, and they basically got him for very, very cheap. Didn't have to go and trade for him since the Portland Trail Blazers just decided to basically get rid of him. Ayton had 14 points and 10 rebounds per game last year for the Blazers, but I don't really think his impact on the game is that great. You saw him last night. He wasn't really necessarily holding his own in the paint. I think this team struggles down in the interior still. After they traded Anthony Davis, they didn't really have anybody they could replace him with. Jackson Hayes wasn't the answer, and I don't think DeAndre Ayton is the answer either. I think this team struggles this season. In the 11th place in the West, I have the Utah Jazz at 34 and 48. They have a lot of young talent on this roster that I like, including Ace Bailey, who I think wins Rookie of the Year. Bryce Sensabaugh is another young player that's a small forward for them with a ton of room to grow. I expect him to break out this year. He averaged 11 points per game off 42% shooting from three last season. I expect him to rise up and maybe be around a 16 to 18 point per game scorer this year. Taylor Hendricks is another young player that's still developing. The same thing with Walker Kessler, who is their defensive anchor. He's still progressing as well and getting better defensively. He's already one of the best shot blockers in the NBA, and then you also see him as well as one of the best rebounders in the NBA. He's definitely a piece that they're going to build around for the future, and I expect Ace Bailey and Bryce Sensabaugh to be part of that core. That team has a lot of young talent, a lot of guys that are young, that are just coming off either their freshman season, coming out of college, just like Ace Bailey, and they obviously jumping to the NBA is definitely a transition. So a lot of those guys are young. A lot of them were top draft picks. I do like this core they're building there in Utah. With that being said, I do expect them to maybe trade Lauri Markkanen at some point to stack even more draft picks. But when I look at this team, I expect them to be somewhat competitive and win around 35 to 38 games or so. I know I have them at 34 wins right now, so we'll say around 34 to 38 games. I know that's a lot more than most people expect. When I look at this roster, I like a lot of players on this team, and I expect some of them to break out, like Bryce Sensabaugh or Taylor Hendricks. I have this team as the 11th team in the West, just missing the playoffs, or I should say missing the play-in tournament. In 12th in the West, I have the Memphis Grizzlies at 32 and 50. They lost Desmond Bane, so that's definitely some scoring that they're going to have to make up. I do like Gigi Jackson a lot. Shout out ClipCase74, one of my friends that is a basketball YouTuber. He talks a lot of things about the NBA. Go check out his YouTube. But he's a big fan of Gigi Jackson. I like what I've seen from Gigi Jackson as well. Would love to see him in a Clippers uniform one day. He's a guy that could potentially sprout and grow on this team this year. A major question with this team, though, is whether or not Ja Morant can stay healthy. Last year, his injury concerns. And even though Ja Morant is still one of the most talented players in the NBA, there is a question about whether or not he can be available. And obviously, Jaren Jackson Jr. has had some injuries as well in the past. I do worry about this team with Bane now being gone, trying to score the ball. If Ja Morant has an off night or is injured, I think this team will struggle. In the 13th place in the West, I have the Portland Trail Blazers at 32 and 50. They're still a young team. I don't see them as a playoff team right now, but they could be competitive with Chumani Kamara, a very good defensive player, Denny Avdia, who is a good scorer, Shaedon Sharpe, who has a lot of potential as well to grow, and he's another guy that could break out this year that I'm a fan of. I expect him to take another step up this year. I expect them at some point to trade Jeremy Grant and maybe even potentially trade Drew Holiday at some point. They do have Damian Lillard on their roster, who's going to be out most of, if not all of this season. They have a lot of veterans on that team, but I still don't think it's enough for them to contend in the West. In 14th in the West, I have the Phoenix Suns at 29 and 53. Their big three right now is Devin Booker, Dylan Brooks, and Jalen Green. that's really not an enticing big three when you look at the rest of the West. Mark Williams was a good player that they got in a trade this offseason. He's going to be a good anchor in the paint. That's something they were missing over the last season or two. So that's definitely going to be good for them. He's a good defensive player that can rebound. But I do think this team struggles. And then in 15th and last place in the West, I have the New Orleans Pelicans at 25-57. Trey Murphy III is an absolute stud. Dude is a bucket getter. I like him a lot. I like Zion Williamson as well. He looks to be in the best playing shape he's been in the NBA. I do think at some point they could potentially entertain trading him. And I've said over the last year or so that if they do ever trade him, I would love to see him in a Clippers uniform. I just don't think this team has enough talent to compete in the West, which is why at some point, if they don't want to keep Zion, they could go out and trade him and get value back. Now moving on to the Eastern Conference, I have the New York Knicks in first place with a 56-26 record. They added Jordan Clarkson and Gershon Yabusele to bolster their bench scoring in the offseason, which was definitely an issue for them in the past. Also, they have Mike Brown as a new head coach and will likely rely more on their bench now than they did in the past with Tom Thibodeau, so that their starting lineup that includes Karl Anthony Towns, Jalen Brunson, OG Anunoby, and Mikal Bridges, they don't burn out. Hopefully, if they do rely on their bench a little bit more, especially in the regular season. They have the most returning healthy talent in the East, I think, with the Cleveland Cavaliers. I think they're going to be very similar talent-wise, and they're both very capable teams of winning the East. The Knicks did also add Malcolm Brogdon in the offseason, but he is now retired. That's definitely a loss for them, but I do still think off the bench, Jordan Clarkson, Gershon Yabusele could be good defense and good scoring, with Clarkson being a good scorer and then Yabusele being a guy that can rebound and play some defense for them down low. So we'll see what happens, but I think the Knicks are the 1 seed in the East. In second place in the East, I have the Atlanta Hawks at 52-30. They had a good offseason, adding Kristaps Porzingis, Luke Kennard, and Nickeil Alexander-Walker. You add that to a lineup that already has Trae Young, who averaged 24 points and 11.5 assists per game last year and is an all-star 2 years in a row for Atlanta. I like Dyson Daniels a lot as well. He broke out last year for the Hawks after being traded in that DeJounte Murray trade from Atlanta to New Orleans. In return, the Hawks did get Dyson Daniels, which he really worked his way last year into being one of the best defensive players in the NBA. And I think this year he's going to work his way into being a top 50 player in the league. Last season, he averaged 14 points, 6 rebounds, and 4 assists with 3 steals per game, which is very, very impressive. He's going to be a really good player for them. I'm really excited to see him even take another step up this year, maybe as a scorer, and be around 15 to 16 points per game with the same defensive production. Also, they'll have Jalen Johnson healthy, which would be huge for them offensively. He's a guy that averaged 17 points per game for them over the last couple seasons, but was hurt. Good to have him back healthy. And then hopefully Zachary Risache, who was a top pick of theirs in the 2024 NBA draft, hopefully he continues to develop and progress. Last year, showed promise and potential as a rookie, averaging 13 points per game. We'll see what this team looks like, but I'm very optimistic about this Hawks team this year. Now moving on to the 3 seed in the East, I have the Cleveland Cavaliers at 50-32. Darius Garland is still coming back from a toe injury that he suffered at the end of last season. He got surgery, if I remember correctly, over the summer. There's no timetable on a return yet for him, but hopefully he's back soon. Donovan Mitchell is a guy that I have said for the last few years is a top 10 player in the league, which he showed each of the last couple seasons. Last year, averaging 24 points, 4.5 rebounds, and 5 assists per game, on top of 1.3 steals per game. Very, very good player. I just think with this Cavs team, they have a lot of talent, but it was disappointing for them in the playoffs last year. But they get back a lot of talent that's healthy this year. I know they did lose Isaac Okoro in free agency, but they do have Evan Mobley as a Defensive Player of the Year candidate year in and year out. DeAndre Hunter, who was a great scorer. He averaged 14 points for them per game last year, primarily off the bench. And then Donovan Mitchell's a top 10 player. And then you add in, hopefully, having Darius Garland back healthy. And then Jarrett Allen as a reliable defensive force. This team's very capable of winning the East. They're a team I've been very high on the last couple of years. I had them, I think, going to the NBA Finals each of the last 2 years, but they disappointed me last year in the playoffs. I just didn't want to be able to take them again and be wrong. Maybe, picking against them in my predictions will end up helping them make a potential run. As the 4th seed in the East, I have the Philadelphia 76ers, which is a major surprise. I have them at 47-35. They added VJ Edgecombe in the draft, who was going to help them defensively and bring a ton of hustle to their lineup. He averaged 15 points, 5 rebounds off 34% shooting last year as a freshman for Baylor. The main question for this team will be health. No one questions the amount of talent they have. They have Tyrese Maxey, Paul George, Joel Embiid, 3 very talented players. I'm very high on Tyrese Maxey. Obviously, the question mark for this team is health, since all 3 of those players were injured at points last season. Maxey is a top 15 player in the league, in my opinion. Very good bucket getter. He averaged 26 points per game last year with 6 assists per game. I expect him to still be around 27 to 28 points per game this year, even with Paul George and Joel Embiid hopefully being healthy. If Embiid and Paul George can play around 65 games, this team could be the 4th seed and win the NBA Finals. This is a bold take, and it's really relying on them staying healthy, but I'm fine saying it. I think this team is definitely capable of making a run to the Eastern Conference Finals. Joel Embiid, last year, he only played 19 games. He played 19 games and averaged 24 points and 8 rebounds. This team will only go as far as their health. I do think Embiid, even though he's been hurt, his ceiling is still higher than Tyrese Maxey's, since Embiid, when he's healthy, is still a top 3 player in the league, in my opinion. And with that being said, even if Embiid is healthy, I still think this is Tyrese Maxey's team, even if Embiid has a higher ceiling, in respect to the rest of the league. I still think this is Tyrese Maxey's team because he's been more reliable and more available over the last couple seasons, and that's definitely what this team needs. As the 5 seed in the East, I have the Detroit Pistons at 44-38. Jaden Ivey is going to miss the beginning of the season, which definitely hurts a little bit, but hopefully he's back healthy soon. They added Duncan Robinson in the offseason to help their 3-point shooting issues and also to replace Malik Beasley. Asad Thompson hopefully will take a step up this year. Jalen Duren, I think, is a stud big man, and I think he's going to be a top 5 big man in the league at some point. He hasn't really showed that potential just yet. It's only been a few years he's been in the league. I've expected bigger and better things from him over the last couple years, and he hasn't really put it all together just yet. Still a good player, but hasn't really lived up to the potential that I thought he would. I think this year could be his breakout year. If you look at last year, he averaged 12 points and 10 rebounds with 1.8 stocks per game. I expect him to be around 18 points and 12 rebounds per game this year, with hopefully around 2 stocks per game. Cade Cunningham absolutely balled out for them last year. 26 points, 6 rebounds, 9 assists per game. He's a very good player and definitely an MVP candidate if that team could be a top 3 or 4 or 5 seed in the East. As the number 6 team in the East, this is a surprise. I have the Toronto Raptors at 42-40. I saw them playing the preseason against the Celtics when they played their entire starting lineup, and I was impressed with the hustle and the underrated talent on Toronto. An issue for them is going to be their positionless starting lineup, which is Emmanuel Quickley, RJ Barrett, Brandon Ingram, Scotty Barnes, and Jakob Poeltl. Barnes obviously can run the 4. He can be a power forward, and Brandon Ingram can be a small forward. But I think when you're looking at this team, when I was watching them play, it was just a little bit positionless, which is the way of the NBA nowadays. Like I've already mentioned, there's no true power forwards anymore, and there's no, pass-first point guards that are playmaking and not trying to score. That's not really the way of the NBA anymore, especially considering you have power forwards and centers shooting threes like Joel Embiid and Alperen Sengun, and then you also have point guards being, big-time scorers like Luka Doncic and SGA. You have big men like Nikola Jokic being able to facilitate and pass the ball like Domantas Sabonis as well as another example. The NBA, it's definitely changed, but I just thought this starting lineup is a little bit positionless, but definitely a lot of talent. I like their bench unit a lot as well. Jamal Shed plays hard with a chip on his shoulder, it looks like, every single possession. Grady Dick could be a good scorer off the bench for them, and Ochai Agbaji is underrated. I like this team. I also like their head coach, Darko Rajakovic. He's going to be a guy that I think is going to elevate this roster this year. Even though people don't have high expectations for this team, I think this team can surprise the people and be a playoff team this year in the East. Now moving on to the number 7 seed in the East, and that's the Orlando Magic, who I have at 42-40 as well, with Toronto taking the tiebreaker over them. Orlando, they have a good starting lineup. Jalen Suggs, Desmond Bane, Franz Wagner, Paolo Banchero, and Wendell Carter Jr. This starting lineup is better this year than it was last year. Adding Desmond Bane as a shooting threat and also a scorer, that's something they needed, somebody they could rely on and get a bucket in a big moment. I do think their depth on the bench is still a worry to me. I think this team underperforms expectations, which is a hot take. A lot of people are very high on this team, and I understand why. You have a player in Franz Wagner coming off a career year averaging 24 points per game. You have another young player in Paolo Banchero who is rising up the ranks in the NBA, and he's been a great player for them. Last year averaging 25.9 points per game with 7.5 rebounds and 4.8 assists. He's been awesome. And then you add a guy like Desmond Bane who can be a 20-point per game scorer any given night. They have a lot of talent. I just worry about their depth on the bench and also their lack of playoff experience. But we'll see what happens. They could potentially surprise me and be a very good team in the East. And that, at the end of the day, wouldn't be too surprising because they do have some talent on this roster, like I just mentioned. Wagner and other players like Banchero and also Desmond Bane. They have talent on this team. And then as the 8th seed in the East, I have the Boston Celtics, who lost a lot of talent this offseason, losing Al Horford, Luke Kornet, Drew Holiday, and Kristaps Porzingis. I do like the addition of Anthony Simons. He's a bucket, and I think C's fans will grow to like him very quickly. He has a similar style of play to Damian Lillard. I expect him to be a very good player for the Celtics this year. Jaylen Brown has the opportunity to shine and elevate his game with Jason Tatum being out. Tatum last year averaged 22 points per game and 6 rebounds. I expect him to be around 25 points per game this year with more shot opportunities coming his way. Sam Hauser as a starting power forward is an issue to me. I think the Celtics front court will be a problem for them. I do like Chris Boucher. I think he's great value as a backup big man on a low contract without much money that is guaranteed and given to him. But I do worry about Keita being the starting center. Keita's a good player, and especially when you're mixing in with Al Horford and Kristaps Porzingis and Luke Kornet. I think throwing the starting role on Keita is going to be a lot for him. And then you also look at their issue at the power forward position. I don't think Sam Hauser is a starting power forward in the NBA, so I think that's going to be a worry there for the Celtics as well. In ninth, I have the Miami Heat, and they are going to be without Tyler Hero for a month or so, which is definitely a worry. I'm a big fan of Davion Mitchell. He's going to be the starting point guard. I think he's the most underrated player in the league defensively, even though he gets talked about defensively and being a good player. I don't think he gets the hype defensively that he deserves. I think he's just one of the most underrated players in the NBA overall. A guy that plays every single possession defensively with a chip on his shoulder and also can get hot, score the ball, and facilitate. I do like him a lot. I think this Miami team goes 40-42. The Celtics, I have it 42-40. Forgot to mention their record. By Miami, I have them under 500 at 40-42. I do like Davion Mitchell, like I mentioned. They have a solid starting five. Mitchell, Norman Powell, Andrew Wiggins, Bam Adebayo, and Khalil Ware. But the bench scoring with Terry Rozier, who they potentially could get rid of at some point, Nikola Jovic, and Jaime Jaquez as their only potential scorers off the bench as of right now. I don't think that's enough in this Eastern Conference, even with it being a little bit weaker than it's been in the past. I did flip-flop the Bucks and the Heat a few times. I ended up giving the Heat the benefit of the doubt. I do like Khalil Ware, and I think he takes a big step up this year, and I think Bam Adebayo and him are definitely going to win some games together this year. And hopefully when Tyler Hero's back healthy, that'll help this Heat team get in a better position. As the 10th seed in the East, I have the Milwaukee Bucks. And like I already mentioned with them, Kevin Porter Jr. is a good scorer, but an inconsistent scorer and an inconsistent shooter. Gary Trent Jr. is a good shooter. He's coming off a 41% shooting from three last year, which is very good, but that's not enough to carry the offense shooting the ball. Kyle Kuzma and Giannis and Miles Turner, those are three good players, and at the end of the day, Giannis is going to be a top three player no matter who's around him. But I just think they needed a better supporting cast of scorers next to him. I do like Miles Turner a lot, but I expect this team to struggle shooting the ball beyond the arc. And that's something that they've needed in the past as a good shooter. And in the past few seasons, they've had good shooters. They've had Pat Connaughton, and they've also had Malik Beasley at one point. They've had good shooters, but right now where they stand, they just are lacking shooting when I'm looking at this lineup. And I could be completely wrong. I could be, way off here, and they could end up being the 4th seed in the East, and no one would be surprised because they have Giannis Antetokounmpo, and he's one of the best players in the NBA for a reason. But I expect this team to have trouble shooting the ball, and I also think if Miles Turner is going out to shoot the ball beyond the arc, it's going to really hurt them trying to rebound if he's staying beyond the three. So the Bucks I have at 38-44. And I have them in 10th. In 11th, I have the Indiana Pacers at 35-47. No Tyrese Halliburton is definitely going to be a big miss for them. And the same thing with Miles Turner being gone. Andrew Nembhard, Benedict Mathurin, Aaron Nesmith, Pascal Siakam, and Isaiah Jackson. I'm a big fan of a lot of those guys. I'm a big fan of Nembhard, Mathurin, Nesmith, and Siakam. But I just think this team, without Halliburton, they're missing their key player. Siakam is one of the league's most underrated players. He's the most underrated all-star in the league, in my opinion. Benedict Mathurin is a guy that averaged 16 points per game last year, and he's my breakout pick of the year, maybe. I expect him to potentially get up there and be a 20-point-per-game scorer with more opportunities. I still think this Pacers team will be competitive. They still have a very good head coach in Rick Carlisle. But without Halliburton, I don't expect them to make a run in the East. In 12th, I have the Washington Wizards, and I have them at 32-50. I like their roster more than most people do, and I think they're trending in the right direction more than most people would say. Bub Carrington, he'll continue to develop. I like C.J. McCollum as a good veteran who can help them score the ball, which has been a problem for them. Bilal Coulibaly will be out a few weeks to begin the year with a thumb injury, but he showed potential last year. Chris Middleton struggles with injuries and is past his prime, but he can still contribute if he's on the floor. Alex Sauer is on the rise, and I think he takes a step up this year. And then adding in another few guys, I like Corey Kispert as a shooter off the bench. I like Cam Whitmore. I think he has, more potential to grow. And I like Keyshawn George as well. I think this team can surprise the people a little bit. I don't expect them to be a playoff team, but I expect them to win, more ball games than people expect, to be a little bit more competitive. In 13th in the East, I have the Charlotte Hornets at 30-52. In 14th, I have the Chicago Bulls at 28-54. And in 15th, I have the Brooklyn Nets at 25-57. As for the Hornets, I like Brandon Miller a lot. I think he's going to break out this year and average around 25 points per game and move his way into the top 30 to 40 players in the league. LaMelo Ball needs to stay healthy for this team to be even remotely competitive. I think this team does struggle, though. Then you look at Chicago. Montes Buzelis showed promise last year and potential as a rookie. I think he elevates his game this year. He averaged just about 8.5 points per game last year. I think he gets in double-digit scoring this year. Kobe White's going to be out a few weeks with a calf injury, which will hurt their offense. And obviously this team last year at this point did have Zach LaVine, and they ended up moving on from him. So we'll see who ends up being the focal point of the offense. This team just doesn't have enough talent to be a playoff team, in my opinion. And I don't think anybody would really disagree with that. And then at 15th, I have the Nets. They're in a complete rebuild, and they're preparing for a year or two from now to go all in and acquire a few big-time stars. That's basically what they're preparing for. They're not really trying to win any games this season, it seems. So now for my playoff predictions, which I'm going to run down very quick. In the play-in tournament in the East, I have the Magic versus the Celtics, and I have the Magic winning that game for the 7th seed. And then I have the Bucks versus the Heat as the 9 versus 10 game, and I have the Heat winning that game. And then I have the Celtics over the Heat to get the 8th seed in the East. In the West, I have the Kings versus the Spurs. I have the Spurs winning that game for the 7th seed. And then the 9 versus 10 game, I have the Lakers versus the Mavericks, with the Mavericks winning that game. And then I have the Mavericks over the Kings for the 8th seed in the West. In the first round of the playoffs in the East, I have the number 1 New York Knicks versus the number 8 Boston Celtics. I have the Knicks winning that series in 6. Then I have the number 2 Hawks, definitely a surprise, but I expect big things from them, versus the number 7 Orlando Magic. I think the Hawks win this series in 7. And then I have the number 3 Cleveland Cavaliers versus the number 6 Toronto Raptors. I think the Cavs win that one in 5. And then I have the 76ers as the 4 seed versus the number 5 Pistons. And I have the Sixers winning that series in 6 games. Now moving on to the Western Conference in the first round, I have the number 1 Thunder versus the number 8 Mavericks. I think the Thunder win that series in 6. That would be an interesting series, though, if Kyrie Irving is back fully healthy. At number 2, I have the Denver Nuggets versus the number 7 San Antonio Spurs. I think the Nuggets win this series in 5 games. I expect them to be even better this season. And this was a team I was down on heading into the playoffs last year. I thought the Clippers would beat them in 5 or 6 games. And then they shocked me. They ended up taking Oklahoma City to 7 games. They added even this offseason as well. I expect this team to be a major threat in the West, which I think a lot of people would agree with, and rightfully so. I have the number 3 Clippers versus the number 6 Wolves. I have the Clippers winning that series in 7 games. Then I have the number 4 Rockets versus the number 5 Warriors. I have the Rockets winning that series in 7. And now for my conference semifinals predictions. In the East, we have the number 1 Knicks versus the number 4 Sixers. I have the Sixers winning that series in 6 games. And then we have the number 2 Hawks versus the number 3 Cavs. I have the Hawks winning that series in 6. In the West, I have the number 1 Thunder versus the number 4 Rockets. I have the Thunder winning that one in 7. I have flip-flopped over the last hour or two about that pick, but I'm going to stay with the Thunder winning that one in 7. I think positionless basketball for the Rockets will definitely at some point come to hurt them, which is something I expect. Whether or not that's in the regular season, the playoffs, we'll see. And then I have the number 2 Nuggets versus the number 3 Clippers. I have the Nuggets winning that series in 7 games. I wanted to pick the Clippers to win this series, but I also want to be unbiased. It seems like picking the Clippers to win the finals each of the last few years really hasn't worked and hasn't brought them any luck. I had the Clippers win the playoffs probably 2 of the last 4 years in the podcast. So now for this being, I think, my 5th year since I've started doing radio at BC and now with my podcast, I wanted to not pick the Clippers because I didn't want to jinx them. And I think the Nuggets are going to be a tough team to beat. So I'm going to be going with the Nuggets here in 7. Then in the conference finals, we have the Hawks versus the Sixers. I have the Hawks winning that one in 6 games. And then we have the Nuggets versus the Thunder, and I have the Nuggets winning that in 7. So in NBA Finals, it is the Denver Nuggets versus the Atlanta Hawks. I have the Nuggets over the Hawks in 6 games. And now for my breakout lineup, I'm going to give a player at each position that I think is going to break out this year. We'll start with Amen Thompson. He's supposed to be the point guard for this Rockets team, and I don't really think he's necessarily a point guard. I think he's more of a shooting guard, but he's going to be running point guard, it seems like, for the Rockets this year. Has all-star potential. I see him as a breakout player this year at the point guard position. Another guy I want to go with was Bub Carrington, but I ended up choosing Amen Thompson since the Rockets, I think, will be in a better position to get more hype and get more attention. And if Amen Thompson has a really good year, has the potential to be an all-star. At the shooting guard position, I have Benedict Mathurin of the Pacers. At the small forward position, I have Bryce Sensabaugh of the Utah Jazz. At power forward, I have Khalil Ware of the Miami Heat. And then at the center position, I have Jalen Duren. I wanted to say Ace Bailey, but he's a rookie, so I didn't really want to put him as the, breakout small forward or power forward, since I don't really think a rookie is a breakout player since this is their first year. And I also want to mention Trey Murphy III. He kind of already broke out last year, so I didn't want to mention him again, but he averaged 21 points per game last year for the Pelicans. We'll see what he does this year. Anyways, that'll wrap up this episode. I know I'll be right with probably some of these predictions. I'll be wrong with some of these. That's the beauty of, doing these predictions before the season begins. Some things will be right, some things will be wrong. And I know some people will disagree with me about some of these takes, but, that's the beauty of sports. A lot of the time, you can debate and, have conversations about, which teams might break out, which teams, might falter, which players might step up, and, which players might take a step back. But I try to be as unbiased as possible with these takes. And, as much as I'd love to say the Clippers would win the NBA Finals, I know in the last few years it really hasn't worked for them. So I ended up going with the Nuggets winning the West, and then obviously the Hawks in the East. I think a fun finals, though, would be the LA Clippers versus the New York Knicks. That was one I almost went with, but ended up going a different route with my predictions. And as I mentioned, some of these things, will be wrong and some will be right. We'll see how things play out. No one ever really knows how the season will go, but, it's definitely going to be a fun one to watch. And hopefully you guys are all able to enjoy it. Wishing all of your teams the best of luck this year. Anyways, that'll wrap up this episode. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to listen to this. As always, I appreciate it. I hope you guys have a good one, and I'll see you guys in the next episode. Thank you.